online or through technology. We ended up with a lot of different results than we expected. This is the September update for COVID-19. I did one about 4 or 6 weeks ago. I plan on doing another one in 4 or 6 weeks because it's an interesting study in how systems of people interact with technology and one another. And that happens to be my little hobby horse I like riding on. Okay, so I should kind of tell you how we got here. I'm a nerd. I'm a process guy. I'm a technical guy. I love system, like I said, love systems of people, watching how we interact with tech, how we create tech. And as part of that, I saw on Reddit, gosh, back early January, somebody was starting to graph this new virus that was in China. I thought, well, what a fascinating idea. And so I clicked in the comments, and there's this whole slew of comments about, oh, how you're graphing it the wrong way, and how you don't really know how to graph a epidemic, and how it might be a pandemic. And being a sort of a nerdy sort, that actually fascinated me even more. So I started following this story of this new virus in China. And that led me to the Reddit scientific forum, which I have been following for the last, 9 months now. Learned a lot about kind of science as it happens real time, as opposed to science as it appears on the TV programs. We've all seen Discovery Channel. We've all been in school where the teachers have taught that we went from A to B to C in more or less a linear order, when that's not actually what happens at all. Scientific advances happen to be very noisy and chaotic and hard to sort of pick apart. And frankly, that just made it even more interesting to me. I am not a political person, or rather, I'm a very political person that hates all political parties currently. So I don't have an agenda. I really don't care who you are, as long as you're a nice person to me. I'll be a nice person to you. I'm just here to tell you about the systems of people and information. Having said that, I was quite fascinated that what happened to me related to COVID about 2 weeks ago. The reason I have a little fist up here is went out with my wife, and we went to one of these pinball museums. A lot of fun. Played pinball for an hour or so. I had a blast. I hadn't played in a long time. And of course, we wore masks, being the good conscientious people we are. We wore them the right way. But as you play pinball, you're doing this, and the mask slides down off your nose. And I don't know, 5 or 6 times it slid down, and I would pull it back up and slid down. But I am playing pinball. I also found that over an hour or so, I started feeling quite dizzy. For personal reasons, I've had gastric bypass surgery, so I lose fluids fairly quickly, and if I'm not careful, I'll pass out, and that's no fun. So at the very end, the last 5 or 10 minutes, the mask fell down, and I just let my nose breathe the air. There was 4 people in the whole place, which is maybe the size of a small supermarket. I wasn't within 12 feet, 15 feet of anybody else, and I was able to stay conscious that way and finish up the game. And we started to leave, and the young man behind the counter, I thanked him, said it was a lot of fun, I really enjoyed myself. And he said, you're wearing your mask wrong, as if he was scolding a toddler. And I said, thank you very much. You're right. I actually, I have a physical problem that's caused me to be quite dizzy, and you're right. But you don't want to be picking me up off the floor, do you? And my wife at the same time said, actually he does have a physical problem, and he's just trying to stay conscious. And the young man said, I won't pick you up off the floor. I'll call security to come get you. And I was just at a loss. He was quite hostile. That's why I have a little fist. This was a frightened young man. He was frightened that I would hurt him or other people. He was angry. He, I guess, had a lot of assumptions about who I was and whether or not I was out to hurt or harm people, or how informed I was about the virus. And it was quite unpleasant. I debated on whether or not to contact his superiors. He was technically correct. I was wearing the mask incorrectly, and he was within his rights to tell me that. And by God, I guess he could have called security. But heck, if I want us to be getting into fistfights, everywhere we are. I told my sons that I've been in a scruffle or two, and I think I could have took the guy. But yeah, it was just sad. It made me very sad that he would be that way. I told him before I left, I said, you're right. Thank you for telling me that. but I couldn't say anything else because the more I spoke to him, the angrier he got. So I just kind of let that go. So as part of my research and as part of sort of being a nerd, liking process stuff, I started posting on Facebook about this COVID information as I found it, trying my best not to sort of announce what the science was, which is just to talk about here's where the discussions are going. Now that was kind of a reasonable thing that most people couldn't agree, couldn't disagree too much about. And motherfucker, I was wrong about that too. People, even talking about where the science was going, people were quite happy to just jump in and start, letting me know whether I was right or wrong. And I think what happened with this young man, I think what's happening on social media, I would hope is that we're watching these extreme views on TV and whatever media we consume, where they have all these sort of catchphrases. COVID's like the flu, maybe would be one you might have heard. Fake news, a bunch of other ones. And we hear these catchphrases, and then when we try to explain a nuanced position back to one another, the other person hears the catchphrase, and it just sets off sort of this torrent of pre-programmed anger and vitriol. And that really sucks. But it's also why we're having the culture. This is why I'm doing this thing. This is a good example of major culture clashing, and I believe it is hurting and killing people. So it's worthwhile to talk about. So I've done a deck so I don't forget my dang points because there's a bunch of stuff I want to go over. I also have a bunch of random articles. I just want to briefly, 5 or 10 seconds, mention them. I'll show them on the screen for you. If you're interested, you can follow up on those. All right, here's my deck. It's very nice. I spend, all of 5 or 10 minutes doing this stuff. So, all right, so COVID-19 recap, September 2020. I have a thesis I've been working on for the past 3 or 4 months. I'd like to do some level setting before we start, because if we don't agree on some level setting, we don't follow along anymore. I don't go anywhere. Talk about some myths, some latest news, and then I'm quite happy to pull a bunch of stuff out of the air and speculate. So my thesis that I kind of fell into was that right now we're all of us are doing a really, really poor job of evaluating both the pandemic and how we're responding to it because of these culture clash, social technology issues. But I think as we move 20, 40, 50 years out and beyond that, this is going to be viewed as a sort of an epic failure at multiple levels of various institutions. And my current suggested reasons, tentative things I'm playing around with, is that most large organizations, and by that I mean over 50, 100 people, can become rigid as far as learning or adapting. They can easily conflate institutional personal goals with their mission as an organization. And so when they communicate to the public, they tend to sort of hone toward their own goals instead of what their actual mission is. And you would think that would be the same thing, but it's not. And then also I think there's this sort of Lord of the Rings institutional ideology at work. And by institution, I mean, colleges, press, state governments, local governments, national governments, World Health Organization, Chinese government, just groups of people that we rely on for orienting ourselves with the world. No, there's no particular bunch or party anybody I'm talking about there. But there's a Lord of the Rings kind of attitude where whatever kind of group you're in, they're your guys. And they're the guys who are going to save the world. And one ring will rule them all, right? I think these 3 things come together to sort of create this mess that we're in. Not sure. Just what I'm working with. Okay, so level setting. These are things I am not prepared to debate you or argue with you. I am an idiot. I don't know most of what I'm talking about. I'm sort of trying to spot patterns and identify and show to you what these patterns are and what they might mean. I am by no means a microbiologist or an economist or a political science expert, a historian. I'm not an academic researcher. I'm not a brain surgeon. I do fly airplanes, but there's a whole list of stuff I do not know. We live in a free and open society where the average citizen, who is an idiot just like me, is expected to inform himself, herself, and make decisions. So I'm an idiot, which is a good, bad, and average thing. More to the point, there are no experts on pandemics. We don't have They're epidemiology experts. Sure, there are people who studied how viruses sort of move amongst populations, and that is a science. There's economists, there's trade experts, there's all sorts of experts. Pandemics, by the simple fact they hit multiple governments and geographical regions at the same time, can't be studied because they don't happen that often. There's no way you can reproduce that. There are 100 systems involved. So you can't be an expert on something you can't observe scientifically. It just doesn't exist. You can be an expert in any number of, like I said, 100 areas or more, and we have them, and we should rely on those folks. But anybody who comes on TV or on the media and says they're an expert on all things pandemic is a freaking liar, and you shouldn't listen to them. They're just probably quite smart on certain areas, and they're willing to speculate on everything else, and that's frankly not helping. It would be better just for them to be, take the I'm an idiot stance like I'm currently taking, because at least then whatever you're proposing is tentative, but that doesn't get you on TV as much. So there is a meta level to intellectual discourse, and if there wasn't, I couldn't do this at all. I really love watching smart people solve problems, and this is the best example I think in my lifetime. Probably the Apollo moonshot would have been there had I been old enough. This is the best example in my lifetime of having a ton of really smart people scattered all over the world working on the same problem simultaneously. This is what the internet was supposed to be about, which is kind of the weird. It's weird that it's dysfunctioning in so many different ways, but this is why we made the internet. Right? This is cool stuff, and I think there's going to be some major scientific breakthroughs as a result of this. But there is a meta level. I can watch smart people discuss things, and I can tell where one person's using ad hominems and appeal to authorities and a bunch of logical fallacies and perhaps psychological warfare, intimidation on the other person. And I can say, that this person here may or may not have a strong argument, but whatever their argument is, they're not making it. So you can certainly observe the discourse and sort of make some calls on what's happening. And if you see the same topic come up, more to the point of kind of how I'm doing this, you see the same topic come up a dozen times over 3 months, and all the people sort of or taking one position are sort of trying their best to be open-minded and take logical positions, and all the people on the other side are kind of at the low level of neener boo-boo. It's a good sign that probably the people trying to be logical, open-minded have a stronger case, because otherwise they wouldn't be so generous about what the position was. This is not empirical reproducible science. I know we live in an age where people like to say science, and then they say, you're a bad person because you have a mustache. Because science says, but this is not science, guys. This is science occurring, right? But this is not, nobody argues about the mass of an electron. So this is noise. This is noisy scientific research trying to come together into science. Right? So this is not applied science. This is the actual development of science, which is really actually more fun, but it's a lot more noisy. And so if people start coming to you saying, we should use these methods of empirical science, that's just not where we are. We're not going to be able to do a randomized controlled trial in any kind of reasonable amount of time. And during that time, people are going to die. So it's just, we are faced, as we are all faced in life, with making the best choices we can with incomplete information. That's just where we are. That's where we've been since this thing came out 9 months ago. So good communication means you simplify the message and you transfer emotion to people. Bears are awesome. Yeah, bears are awesome. And so there you go. So if I just made you excited about bears, I've communicated well to you about bears. So you want a simple message, and you'll get people excited one way or another. So the better communicator you are, oddly enough, probably the more disservice you're doing to the public in a situation like this, because your enthusiasm to communicate is actually the complete opposite of what's needed to do the science. I'm sorry, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles. All right, so Stephen Smith, call out to you, bub. Had several friends post this to me on Facebook. I've seen a bunch of different variations on this. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is basically one in, like I said, a series of memes which are, you stupid redneck asshole. You're unable to gauge the risk. Here, what you should actually be doing, and here's how you compute whatever, whatever. I brought this up not to pick on my friend Steven, but I brought it because it's an example of trying to correct something that is wrong with something that's wrong itself, and that's kind of wild. In this case, they're saying you're wrong because you computed the death rate because you're taking the population and putting that as the denominator and the numerator being the total people dying. And of course, we all don't have the virus. So then it suggests that we do that against the cases that have an outcome, which means you have to define what an outcome is and whether or not there are long-term or short-term effects. And actually, just by saying have an outcome, you've already sort of said that you can't compute the number at all. And then it actually goes ahead and computes the number at 5%, which I guess that's better than 10%. I don't know. So, and then finally, it's working on the presumption that both the arguer and the arguee, the target, you should be using total numbers of cases and deaths or whatever, which the initial thing you're pushing against is wrong. The argument against it is wrong, and the conclusions are wrong. Matter of fact, it's at the point where it's not even wrong. It's not about anything that's important, is the problem. So it presumes to give us information that doesn't exist. And I've also seen this, one of my other favorite ones is where you yell at Uncle Joe or Grandpa and tell him, he's not a scientific researcher. And there's this list of things one would do as a scientist: collect papers and do notes and a bibliography. Yeah, Grandpa Joe don't have to do his PhD thesis to be an informed voter. So that's, I think it's being mean to Grandpa, and secondly, and more to the point, you're not educating him on anything. You're not making him a better person or yourself a better person. You're just being really a jackass and an asshole doing that, and putting those people in the world. You don't do that anymore, please. And I want to kind of go back to this not even wrong thing. Here's a stat I pulled randomly off the internet this morning. Is how much of a threat you think the corona outbreak is to your personal health. And it's got male, female, and it's got a breakdown by ethnic group and major, minor, not a threat. So one would look at this and I guess determine, how much people think this is a threat to them based on their ethnicity. But the thing is that your ethnicity really is not a prevailing factor in any of this shit to begin with. So why would one create a graph of this nature unless we just want to argue about whether Hispanic people are more afraid than other people? I don't know where this goes in the public health discussion that's anywhere useful. It may be very fine as far as the political discussion goes, and I'm doing my best not to do politics or policy, but this is another thing that appears to be informative that's not, and sadly this is kind of the state of affairs for most information out there. So to give you an example of this, I went to the CDC site last week, probably a couple weeks ago, and I was interested just for myself in hospitalizations, because I was trying to find a number that we could actually track instead of case rate, which is a whack number, and outcomes a whack number. So, if you're sick enough to go to the hospital and they give you the test and you have COVID, that is a measurable event. So the ultimate measurable event, as I said last time, is deaths. Right? So end of the day, historians will go back and do deaths, on average versus deaths during the pandemic, and we will know the number, right? That'll take a while. But hospitalization is probably the second, finest or sort of most detailed or verified number I could find, because whether you're in a hospital or not. In a modern country, if you get sick, you end up in the hospital, and they give you a test, and so the tests have a standard criteria for being given. There's outcome: either you get out of the hospital or die. So I figured, okay. So here's the hospitalizations for COVID over a period of, 6 months. It came out in March. And I specifically looked at the overall number on the bottom. It's the black number. And then my age group, 50 to 64, because I was wondering how relatively concerned I should be, based as compared to the general population. And it didn't, to me, you can see yourself, it's a higher number. Maybe there was a spike kind of like late March or something, but it didn't really appear to be uh, something I should be more concerned than the population. Not that I should be more or not less. I'm not saying be concerned or not. I'm just saying relative to other people, should it be something I should care about? I mean, should I wear like a body condom or? But no, it just doesn't look that way. And I thought, well, wow, that's more optimistic than I thought. Let me look at my father-in-law's age group. And I punched up the 85 plus number, and holy shit! So 50 to 64. Uh, one might argue there's no data there. It's just it's a curve that slightly follows the curve underneath. 85 plus, freaking something interesting is going on in this graph, regardless of whatever else. So whatever I selected on has some interesting information to dive down. In this case, it was 85 plus. But that's a number we can actually start talking about doing some science around and figuring out what's going on and all that. But so you have to find data to chase down to start doing science on. If your data is only defined in terms of either non-tractable, so ethnic group, or it doesn't have any signal, which is the previous graph I showed you, there's nothing there to chase around, right? But that doesn't prevent us from making news stories. So yet again, we've got this plethora of crap. A graph I wanted to put in here I couldn't find was age, perceived risk versus risk. I found a couple of these, and dang if I can find them again. And they're always quite controversial because this is not about the science of the disease. It's about that sort of the science of the communication, which is why we're doing this. If you're young, you think the disease is like 20, 50 times more dangerous to you than it is. If you're old, you think the disease is roughly 10 times less dangerous to you than it is. Both of these are wildly inaccurate. Overall, most people think that the death rate is about 20 or 40 times higher than it actually is. I don't think anybody has any idea of how prevalent the disease is in our society in various places. This is a failure. This is a failure of the media system, the education system, the academia, the government. This is a failure. If the voters, back to my previous point, if the voters don't know how risky something is, how prevalent it is, where the signals are, where they aren't, there's no way in hell we're going to have any sort of reasonable public discussion on these things. It's just the table's not set for anything reasonable to happen. So if you ask people, and this was I think a month or two ago, if you ask people if they've seen fake science or bad science or whatever on social media, most all of them say yes. I think it's up to probably about 80 or 90% now. I haven't checked recently, but everybody agrees that they're seeing bad stuff on social media. They all agree that it's people who disagree with on other things. What are these things? Funny, I should ask myself. So if you're Republican or leaning Republican, it's the fake news, and if you're Democratically, it's the Republicans. If you don't care either way, you believe about 50% of the time that the media is actually exaggerate the risk. So I think in general, my call on this, for what it's worth as an idiot, is the media has exaggerated the risks, but they exaggerate different risks depending on what media diets you consume. If we look at how everybody feels about various risks, the top two is healthcare system becoming overwhelmed and the world experiencing global economic depression. Okay, so these are actually, in my opinion, I'm trying to admit my ignorance, these seem to me like two pretty good risks to be worried about. It's just that you're always worried about the other guys being wrong more than you are about what your risk is. So I think overall, oddly enough, we have in general a pretty good weighted value of kind of what the risks to society are. But we have a very, very bad idea of the diagnostics, what goes on inside these risk areas or what's influencing them. It's so that's an odd state of affairs. Where actually, I think probably the more we communicate on this with having the table set poorly, probably the worse informed we are and the more rigid we are in our opinions, which also odd. Okay, so now I'll talk about the myths because I just keep seeing these pop up over and over again. First myth I have to talk about because it seems such a reasonable thing to believe. A few friends of mine I've seen on Twitter and social media saying, I don't want anybody to die or to be hurt long term from this, and I feel like we should do whatever we can to prevent that from happening. So it's a very, very reasonable thing to want. I also want nobody to die or be hurt. The problem is when you're dealing with millions of people, we have to be realistic here. When the military deploys 100,000 people to training exercise, they have to think carefully whether they want to do that or not because they kill people in training exercises. You can't make decisions about large numbers of people. Anything, even failure to make a decision, anything you make at a large scale is going to hurt and kill people. That's just there's no free lunch here, right? So it's you can't do X to save grandpa or whoever and not hurt cousin Sue. There's just there is no free lunch, and if your media diet consists of a bunch of anecdotes about people being hurt, well, then it's just really who you want to see be hurt. Here's a local shopkeeper out of work because of the depression, who shot himself because he's depressed, or addiction stories for those against lockdowns. Right? You could just go down this anecdotal list of all these people hurt and how they hurt one another and the damage the lockdown's done, assuming you're against lockdowns. Or if you're for lockdowns, you could, here's the story of the city who didn't have lockdowns and the orphan that died because that not being so. If you're only going to share anecdotes with one another and you pick a policy, you just got to give up this zero sum game. That world does not exist for us. So whatever we're talking about in policy, which is one of the reasons I don't want to talk about, I'm trying my best not to talk. I don't. You guys do whatever the hell you want to do. It's because there is no free lunch. It's just anybody who's being honest with you will say, we don't know, we're making guesses, and we're going to kill people because of that. And that's the truth. That's one of the reasons I gave politicians a lot of slack coming into this, because there are no right answers. So, second big myth is case rate as an indicator of public policy. So when we started having tests, oh gosh, back in February, I was, like I said, I was talking about this online. I was like, we really should start testing every freaking body. And then we'll do this sort of massive test. Maybe we could all test once a week. And I was taking apart the problem as if I were a programmer, which I am, and saying, okay, what are the smallest pieces and do the testing, whatever. And then I started thinking about it. And after a week or two, I'm like, no, that's not what we should do at all. And my friends were like, what the hell are you talking about? Of course we should test. Like, yes, we should test as an indicator personally, whether you should get help or not. We should test maybe as part of business coming in the doors. There are all sorts of testing that are quite good. But using case rate as an indicator of whether our public policy is working or not, that's just a non-starter. And the reason why is it's so asymptomatic and we don't have any idea of who has it or not. So case rate really is just a function of how many people you test. Case rate is a non-statistic. And I continue to see over and over again, people use this non-statistic as if it meant something. It means nothing. If everybody got the virus and nobody got sick or died, tree falls in the wilderness and nobody's around to hear a sound. There's nothing. You have to go by measurable symptoms, and measurable symptoms would be hospitalization, death, maybe inflammation if we can track that at some point. But you can't go by I tested something that has no visible effect on other people. That's just it doesn't mean anything. Another big myth I've seen going on and on is this RNA presence as indicator of spread. So we have a lot of really cool DNA RNA technologies. We're able to go back and find who killed the butler in the game of Clue. We can do cool stuff with finding RNA and DNA. And we've been using this cool technology to find little pieces of COVID-19 all over. By the way, SARS-CoV, whatever is the name of the virus, COVID-19 is the name of the disease. You can have the virus without the disease. Just so you guys know that they're two different things entirely. But anyway, so we can test for, and it's important to know that because we can test to see if the virus is in there or in various places. And what that really does is go down the DNA, RNA fragments and match up enough pieces so that you know that there's some piece of a virus. Viruses in DNA turn out to be quite small, much smaller than an ant. So it's become quite a parlor game for to go around swabbing packages from China and school children's ears and various things. Yeah, you can find a lot of RNA for a lot of things all over the place. Doesn't mean you can catch it. Just means we're always shedding little tiny bits of stuff everywhere. Matter of fact, it doesn't mean anything, long and short of it, except for maybe somebody who had the virus came through recently. That probably didn't mean that. I read somewhere that they did a case study breakout in a hospital where the people were transferring the RNA from their clothes, the ICU workers from inside the internal intensive care unit just to the outside, just with their feet and their clothes or whatever, and they were shedding virus. Now, of course, headlines, right, ICU workers spread virus or some kind of crazy over the top shit. But that's not really what it was showing. Just showing that trying to keep every little speck of virus off every little thing, that's completely insane. Symptoms as an indicator of having it. Wow, that's a big one. I had a graphic. I don't know if I put this in. I don't think I did. Yeah, I should find that before we leave. There was a graphic that went down, and this was a meta-graphic of like 30 or 40 different case studies that study various large populations. The Princess Cruise, the prisons in Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina. Like I said, it was 15 different case studies they'd done of thousands of people. And symptoms, you could easily see that symptoms had jack shit to do with whether or not you actually had it or not. I think the prison population prevalence was like I'm trying to remember, 9% maybe, and they had like one person hospitalized, and that was out of tens of thousands of people. But then they did say senior homes, and they had maybe 22% who had it, and over half or 2/3 of them had been hospitalized, and they had a bunch of deaths. So it gets back to, if you're more of a vulnerable population and you get it, more likely you're going to show it and die, and we can see that and measure it. Whereas if you're not, it doesn't exist to us. So yeah, in the United States alone, there's no doubt in my mind there are tens of millions of people who already have this. Who probably most of them don't know it. That's, as long as they don't have any long-term effects. We'll talk about that later. That's fine. The fatality rate indicated public danger. So this goes back to this previous meme. These people who made this meme were upset at the other side for doing fatality rate and what I agreed to be a most wacky way of doing it. The danger here with coronavirus is not the fatality rate. I hate to sound like that. There's anybody that dies or has long-term effects. It's an awful thing. The danger is healthcare system overload. So yeah, if you're over 85, you've got a significant chance of dying. But the thing is that you're just as likely to be hospitalized if you're like 40. So we fill the hospitals up with younger people who probably aren't going to die but have to be hospitalized. Then you're in a car wreck and you can't get ER treatment, or you're one of the older people who needs intensive care and it's not available. It's the spiky nature of this that keeps screwing people up. Not dividing things out for some sort of fatality rate does not give you anything. Matter of fact, I'm willing to make another guess here. If you do death statistics decade over decade, not year over year, month over month, but decade over decade, I don't think this will spike it at all, aside from the healthcare overload. So I think that this is probably a mean way of saying that most of the people, maybe 99.9% of people who are becoming ill and dying from this are people who would have died anyway within 10 years. And like I said, I just made that up. Nobody deserves to die. I don't mean that in a cruel way. I'm just saying that numbers lie, and depending how you look at it, you can say there's no death rate at all, or death rate. So it's just, I think the whole issue of death rate is a non-starter. When you look at healthcare overload, that's the thing we should be concerned with, unless we're talking about our personal risk. Another myth is people are deliberately lying. So talked about this being sort of a failure of institutional learning and adapting. So usually the pattern here is you'll show some politician who's doing a bad job, or some institution you don't like, the local health department, and you'll go down the list of things they've done that are wrong, and then one will conclude by saying, oh, this person is evil, they're lying to us for whatever purposes. I I really wish I could live in a world that was so Manichean, sort of black and white, good versus evil. That's just not the world we live in, guys. These things that we're observing are just a natural consequence of the way these systems are structured. They're not, you know, no Darth Vader is needed here. There's no evil overlord, corporate, whatever. Bill Gates is not out to kill the world. Just give it up, all right? Sadly, we're doing this to ourselves, and we're doing this to ourselves for very good reasons, and it's being done by people who mean well and are trying to help one another. So I wish it was simple as just meaner, neener, but it's not. And like I said, that's also one of the reasons it's so interesting to me. And then my favorite is it's like the flu. And the reason I like this as a myth is because it sort of checks off the little check boxes for the reasons we're so screwed up communicating. It's a very simple message. It conveys concepts anybody can identify with, and and it's completely wrong. It's not even. It's not even wrong because it's not the flu. It's a coronavirus, which is not like a flu. It's nothing like the flu. That's a meaningless statement. However, we pass it around all the time as if it meant something. So it sucks. Okay, so here's some random clippings I got. I thought I would quickly go over these things. About 15 of them. I want to sort of share with you sort of some of my reading over the last month. Here we have Texas A&U. Early spread appears far greater than initially reported. I think the headline for this was historic spread caused by lack of testing, maybe. So wow, talk about if you don't know something's there, it's a good chance it's bigger than you thought it was. And if you've never seen this before, whatever it is historic. So it's sad, very sad. That's that sort of one here. The other myth I want to do is herd immunity, because people who want to sort of downplay the thing, and people who are quite concerned about not being safe enough, want to kind of bang heads over this concept of herd immunity. Herd immunity is the math you do where you figure out the R number, which is how likely a person is to transmit to other people. You do the inverse of that, and you're able to look at, for a population, how many people must be immunized or unavailable to be infected, and another for it to kill any sort of new infections. So this is like all the other concepts you're hearing. Just because our language is coarse doesn't mean we're stuck not using them. But if you talk to the scientists, they will tell you what I'm going to tell you is true. So I'm not trying to lie to you. The R number is not a number. Right? So the R number is, on average, in a world where there are no interventions and we walk around bumping into one another as if we were random molecules in a cubic meter of space, how many people would I transmit this virus to? I think COVID, most people agree, is 3.7. So if I were sick and I were meeting people at random, I would give 3.7 people the virus, and that's quite alarming. You don't want to go there. However, that's just a number. Once you start putting people in hospitals, once you start lockdowns, masks, once you start socially isolating, anything you do starts dropping that number down, right? So the news we should expect, and I said this early on, I haven't changed my opinion on the news. The way this should work is we should have these high numbers that are quite alarming that should drop over time as we get better health care, as we understand what practices we can use not to have them. There's a site, I don't know if I have it or not, that does the R number per U.S. state. And I think most all of them are now under 1, which means that it's dying off in every state so far. Might be something to look at. But the herd immunity is the concept of, and for corona, it's like if we could only get like 82% of the population immune to infection, we could never have any more infections. So those on the side of herd immunity will say, we'll just send all the young people out, get them all sick. Because the young people, you could pick the lower age group of 80% or so and not get the high risk folks. And then once they're all sick, the population, will be fine because there'll be herd immunity. Well, that's just all kinds of wrong, because the thing is that 20% of the population you're protecting, those are the people you should protect. We're not random molecules bumping into one another, right? So even if you got the 80% in that case, that 20% you can kill half of them just with poor personal protection equipment, hygiene, or whatever. That's the only thing that would do was prevent random spread amongst people who wouldn't really suffer that much from it to begin with, which This is back to the tree falling. I'm not making you sick, but you wouldn't know if you were sick if I gave it to you, so shouldn't you be thankful? Um, More to the point, on the other side of this discussion is the idea that herd immunity is sort of some Boolean yes or no thing. So no, it's not. Just like the R number fluctuating all over the place depending on policy, herd immunity fluctuates depending on how people mix, right? Um, it appears that there are a lot of people who travel a lot and talk a lot and do a lot of things close together with one another. I don't know what percent of the population, but there's a lot of folks like that. There's a lot of folks who don't see very many people like myself, who don't mingle. The people who move around and talk a lot to other people, these are the people who have gotten sick because of the nature of their personalities and their social interactions. People who don't, the people who haven't gotten sick. Um, but what that means in terms of herd immunity is that once these traveler, talker, singer people are immune, or they have it, they're done with it, then they're not spreading anymore. So what we have seen empirically, and I'm not saying this is always going to be true, but it seems to be true in a bunch of places so far, is that the population gets to about 20-25% of coverage. Everybody's had 25% of people have it, and those people are this mix of, moving around folks, and then it just dies off, and then we might see a second bump, but it's nowhere near what it used to be in the past. Doesn't mean the danger. I'm not saying the danger goes away. I'm just saying the normal way we have of massively transmitting it dies off. If we still mixed, 100,000 people in a sports stadium, had them all sing for an hour, yeah, you're probably going to have a lot of sick people. But herd immunity does not work. It's not a Boolean thing. In my mind, we've reached enough of herd immunity probably in 95% of the United States, especially the places who had early spikes like New York City. That you're not going to see a second spike there. For the places who did the initial strict lockdown, like Hawaii, I don't know if they're going to come out ahead overall long term. They're starting to see spikes now, which means that that same 20% has got to get out. A lot of these people, firefighters and social workers, so that spread has to happen. You got to burn through that 20% one way or another. Can they stretch that out until we have a vaccine? I don't know. Does that mean that Sweden, these other people who let people out earlier did a better thing? I also don't know. I'm trying to stay away from policy discussions. I started this thing out saying it was going to be 10, 20, 50 years, and I believe that. This has gotten so politicized that nobody can talk about this reasonably, and I try to avoid it as much as possible. So yeah, there's no way we're going to get an answer to that. But herd immunity is not a yes or no thing, so don't do that either. Okay, robust T cell immunity, convalescent individuals. So you can be immune to it even if you have no symptoms. That people have argued about that for a while. Yes. Another myth, I forgot until I just saw this, was you can catch it again. And the cool thing about this myth is yes, you can catch it again. I think I know of two people, one in China and one in Arizona. The fact that there are only two people, or maybe a handful of people with 100 million people infected worldwide, means that it's such a rare event that no, you can't get it again. So it looks very much like the coronavirus. Once you have it, you don't get it again. Yay! Looks like you can keep it immunity for a while. We've seen it for about 9 months now, and so we haven't seen any reinfections in Wuhan, and they had hundreds of thousands of people infected. So I think it's reasonable to say that you would at least have a year where you couldn't get it again. If it works like the other coronaviruses, some studies have shown that the more colds you get and the more you're able to bounce off of colds, probably the less you're ever going to know you have it. So small children who keep colds all the time, this is why they get it and they never know they have it. They're naturally immune to it because their immune system's so adaptive. So yeah, so for those who have been worrying about immunity not lasting, that doesn't seem to be an issue, at least year over year. When we get a year down the road, we can look at it again, and there are several long-term studies that are looking at that way. Yeah, another recursion event. This was the you look this up if you want to. I think this is one in Brazil. This is the Yale risk of COVID-19 hospitalization rises exponentially with age. So we just saw the graph. I showed you the graph from CDC on that. And it's proportional to T cell production. Basically, it's a long way of saying that the more adaptive you are to new diseases, the less likely you're going to end up in the hospital. Okay, so here another example of how these myths sort of combine to make bad policy, bad information. India has been praised for some time as being has done a wonderful job of response to the virus, and they have had many hospitalizations. Or they've been monitoring the deaths. They haven't had a lot of extra deaths. So they decided to go through and do a seroprevalence study, which you just go through and randomly measure who's got it or not, which is the only freaking way you can measure public policy with these things. Even then, I'd want to have a couple studies. 40%. So 40% of the people in Indian slums had this, and meanwhile they were congratulating themselves on how good a job they had done for keeping it out of the slums. So I'm not. This is not ragging on India or even the idea of the test. This is to underline the problem with using, you know, cases test cases as being some sort of measure of policy. Assuming you had 40% of the population who had this and you didn't know it and they didn't know it and everybody was fine. Uh, I'll give you an example. I don't mean to pick on California, but I have to use some example. Governor of California, as I understand, in the last week has said they're going to keep the lockdown going until they only have one new case of COVID tested for each 100,000 people. Well, look at India. They've got, up until the study was done, they were fine. They had no new, zero or very small new cases. Everything was happy. A random healthcare worker could walk through the slums and test two people, and find, or two or three people, and find a new case, and they could stay locked down for the next 20 years based on this thing that the governor of California wants to do. Here we have using this tested cases as a metric, which is a non-stat, against a public policy, which is a measurable thing. This is bad. I want to say this is bad science, and I think that I will at least say that the math here does not support the criteria they're using to make policy decisions from. So Indian, 40% of the population, there weren't massive deaths, there weren't anything that could be observed from the outside. We're seeing this again and again. I've probably come up with half a dozen of these different studies where, oh my God, all these people were sick and we didn't know it. Doesn't mean it's not serious. Indian population happens to be mostly under 25, so there are other issues at play here. It just means the only point I'm trying to make is trying to use test cases is far beyond whack. Recent study a week ago was a Boston super spreading event. So this gets back to the looks good. Bam, we have a disaster, which is why I was cautioning against thinking that simply because that 20% had it meant they were out of the woods. In February, they had a conference in Boston. I think it was, I forget what the name of the conference was. And it became a super spreading event where thousands and thousands of people got it at one spot. So it's going to be interesting to go back and look at the history of this to see how many just big chunks of thousands of people at a time got sick in these super spreading events, as opposed to these one-ofs like me and the pinball. I don't know. I'll be interested to see how that works out. Another aerosol emission, super emission, singing, loud voices, things coming out of your mouth, coughing, sneezing, you transmitting the virus. What this means, I'll talk about this in a second. This is dishonesty during a pandemic. I have seen this quite a bit. And by dishonesty, probably is too strong a word. If an academic group is not interested in a particular breakdown of data, or institutions such as the health department, whatever, you're not going to find that data. They're just not going to present it to you. So what we're seeing is that, I guess for political reasons, I don't know why. I think really it's just more the fact that they don't think something's important, so they don't share it. And when we're in an unknown situation like this, we should share as much as possible. The dishonesty to me is probably the wrong word here. Feline coronavirus drug inhibits the virus. This is the virus once again. SARS-CoV-2 is the virus, and COVID-19 is the disease. This is, I would say, 70% of the scientific studies I see are like this. This is good news if you're a cat, because cats won't get COVID. Dogs suck, I guess. I don't know. So I keep seeing these studies that restate things that anybody, nothing to do there. So Nature magazine, the journal of science, everybody loves Nature. The coronavirus is most deadly if you're older and male. New data reveal the risks. As many people have pointed out online in the COVID forum, Anybody in their right mind following literature knew this 6 months ago. This is not a headline. There's best I can figure. I think somebody tried to put it kindly. What nature's doing is going back through the dozen or so studies that have told us what we've already known, reassembling it as if it were new news in an effort to sort of give an imprimatur, a stamp of approval. This is actually the truth now. And if that's what they want to do, okay. But not news at all. Schools. I saw somebody yesterday was like, I'm just so scared about my children in schools. I have never been scared about your children in schools. Maybe you should. I'm more concerned about the cafeteria workers and older folks. We're getting a lot of studies from schools reopening. Kids lick one another. The kids are rife with this stuff. Okay, they're always rife with this stuff. Thank goodness, they're not dying from it, because it would be bad if they were. Were they transmitted or not? Different question. I don't think I have the study, but there was a couple of studies that said inside the household, if you live together with a child or a teenager, it was only like a 10 or 20% chance you would actually catch it from the other person, which is quite odd, actually. And maybe the reason is that as children, when we do all our singing and yelling or whatever, it's with other children. And teenagers do it in the room or with other teenagers. So we don't spend a lot of time with grandpa, singing ballads from Ireland. And if we did, probably we'd kill him. So as far as I can tell, tentatively, kids are not some horrible vector. They're not going to be falling over dead or anything. That's not going to happen. And I hope that I'm right. And like I said, I'm an idiot. I know nothing, but I've seen several studies that kids have it and they're not spreading it. This is more to the point. You can not know you have it to become immune to it anyway. Masks are good. Yay, masks. And I be sure you put your mask over your nose, because beat that crap out of it. We're going to beat Grandpa up in order to save Grandpa. We must burn the village to save the village. So yeah, masks are good. Viral load predicts mortality. Viral load is the amount you have in your bloodstream, not the amount you're sharing with people. The inoculum is the amount you get initially. The reason masks are good, as we talked about this last time, is that the more virus you get at the first point you get the virus, the more likely you are to get sick and die. And so by having a mask over a period of a few months or whatever, you get less and less virus over a spread out period of time, and your immune system adapts, even if it's kind of slow, and you're good, which is yay. And if you're over 70, you should wear a mask all the time when you're outside. But in general, this is kind of a story. It's not a story. If you come to the hospital and you got a lot of virus in your bloodstream, you're not doing so well. And this is interesting to the point that you don't die from the virus. You die from the inflammation the virus creates in your blood vessels. So by having a lot of virus in your system when you show up at the hospital, it's just really kind of showing the doctors that you're going to have this complete cytokine storm that's just going to very well cause a lot of harm to you. Yeah, this is the record-breaking story. Gaps in early surveillance of coronavirus led to record-breaking start. So here we have a bunch of kind of falsities strung together. The record-breaking thing, gaps in, you can't have a gap in surveillance if you didn't have tests you could roll out, and the FDA has some responsibility there. But yeah, this is just fear-mongering. Speaking of fear-mongering, researchers show children are silent spreaders of virus that causes COVID-19. Right, so anybody in their right mind would read this and say, oh my God, researchers show children are silent spreaders of virus that causes COVID-19. Read it carefully. They're not saying children spread COVID-19. They're saying children are silent spreaders of the virus that causes COVID-19. This gets back to this RNA shit. Okay? Children are full of all kinds of crap. And you go to any kind of school, start measuring RNA, you're going to find all kinds of COVID. They are saying what we really already knew, which is children are little cesspools of infections. And if you hang around kids, you're going to get a lot of those little particles, those infections. Whether they infect or not is not even addressed in this study. But the headline makes it out to appear as if they're little typhoid Marys running around. There's no evidence, in fact, shows just the opposite. But yeah, sure, you're going to find a lot of COVID-19 hanging around any kind of bunch of kids. And this is what they did. So it's non-news switched around to look like it's the end of the world. New Zealand doesn't have COVID-19. If you live on an island and don't let people come, you don't get diseases. It didn't work out so well for the Native Americans once the Europeans showed up, but it can work for a small amount of time. This is fascinating. Odor sensing cells in your nose is where you're probably going to get this from. So it looks like the entryway is most likely your sense of smell. And this correlates to stuff we saw early on where some of the early symptoms were a loss of smell. So I don't know. I wonder if plugging up your nose might help. And I wonder if just masking your nose and having your mouth open. There's another study that knew that mouthwash actually decreases your ability to catch it, which is another one's kind of common sense things. You keep running for alcohol solution through your mouth, you're not going to catch stuff. But yeah, odor sensing. Body temperature screening doesn't help identify infected young travelers. So this is another way of restating: you're young, you get it, you don't know you have it, you have no symptoms, you may be full of the virus, you're probably not giving it to anybody. Checking you for body temperature, that's a non-starter. Doesn't do much anything. All right. So there we went through a bunch of stuff. I did my thesis. I did. All right. Thesis. This is an example of organizational learning, a failure of organizational learning. Level setting. I'm an idiot, but I want to talk about the meta cultural issues involved. Myths. There's a dozen myths as I've kind of gone over them. Latest news. I think I've hopefully shown how the same data can be slanted different ways. Something I want to be clear about. I've been watching this for 7 or 8 months. I have not seen new news in 3 months or more here. One of the reasons I stopped doing it is because it stopped becoming about science and started becoming more about politics. And I don't see any way to have a reasonable conversation that way. But there's nothing going on now that we didn't know 3 months ago. It's just being repackaged and resold. The new news is in the vaccines and how they're doing such a great job with the vaccines. There's like I said, 40, 50 vaccines in progress right now. They're going to do some real kick-ass stuff with them. So no new news. A lot of stuff repackaged, just sort of fear-mongering. A lot of people arguing over data where they've categorized the data in such a way that you can't have a reasonable discussion one way or another. My best guess where this all goes is that we see, with already vaccines in phase 3 trial, I think we'll see more and more vaccines used on populations. I'm guessing they're not going to have serious side effects. I certainly hope so, because if they do have serious side effects, then there'll be this whole pushback on that, and more people will die. I think maybe after we get past the U.S. presidential election, we'll be able to have some reasonable discussions about, what we did as far as policy. If I had some recommendation to make for policymakers, it would be push the policy down to the lowest level possible, because if you live in a county with 12 nursing homes, you'd better be pretty damn strict on what people do. If you live in a county in Arizona where only 7 other people live, nobody cares, and we should leave the population alone. This Lord of the Rings idea where we should have one ontology of what's going wrong or not, and then one person, the governor perhaps, should make some proclamation about what we should all do. Because there are no free lunches, this idea we can do that, it's killing people. And so it's not the policies themselves, it's the concept that we can sort of make these universal calls and there be no downside at all. That's simply not true. Okay, so here's my final slide with my cool 3D book animation. Thanks for hanging out. This has been kind of longer than normal, but there's been a bunch of stuff going on. I am Daniel Markham, and I will